All right, welcome back. It's the Awkward Interviews. And I've had my eye on this lady for years now. Her work is unflinching and critically important, and as I myself know, dangerous. Cerise Castle has worked for Vice, HBO, NPR, and MTV, among others, but she's most well known for her award-winning expose uncovering the hideous violence of police in the US. Specifically, in March 2021, Cerise published her series, A Tradition of Violence, The History of Deputy Gangs in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. To get into these gangs or rise in the ranks, cops in LA have to kill people, and almost always people of color. And they do, and they have for generations. 1 month after her report dropped, Cerise was detained at a press conference while she was doing her job reporting by the very people she wrote about and spoke about. This year, she received the American Journalism Online Award for Best Use of Public Records and the International Women's Media Foundation Courage in Journalism Award. Today, we'll be talking about all this, plus her new podcast series that launched just last month. Cerise, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So where do you want to start? Well, it is election day. Let's do that real quick. Thoughts on electoral politics, what's going on in LA, for instance, what types of things maybe we can change at the local level versus doing things outside of the system?
Yeah, well, I do think, first of all, I hope everybody voted that's listening to this. I know that voting can sometimes feel like not really the most effective thing to do, but trust me, it really does make a difference, particularly at the local level. I think that, really engaging on the local level can help alleviate some of the issues that we see at the national level, and it can definitely help prevent, these ghoulish figures that sort of appear in national politics. They all get their start somewhere, and that's usually at the local level. Here in LA, we do have the chance to vote in a number of progressive candidates, people that are campaigning on platforms of things like universal basic income, defunding the police, ideas like that, which is really exciting to a lot of people. We also have a race for sheriff of Los Angeles County. We do have the chance to vote out Alex Villanueva, who has overseen a lot of particularly horrific deputy gang violence over the past 4 years. But of course, I have to caveat that with, as far as policy goes in the sheriff's department, a lot of the issues that we've seen will not honestly be fixed with the changing of the guard, the changing of the head of the department. But, engaging in these elections, making sure that we have candidates that rise to the top of the primary, that are representing ideas that people want to hear about, is super important, as is, voting and turning in that ballot.
Yeah, and you brought up a few interesting points. I always talk about it this way. The 10 demands for justice were created as material to be brought to a city council. If you don't elect people to the city council that will consider the 10 demands, then you've kind of you've stalled yourself right from the beginning. You brought up some other points though, like the people all start somewhere. So these ghouls we're terrified of now, we could have stopped them years ago. And I never even thought about that way, but that's really important. And obviously also you talked about Villanueva and you talked about defund the police, two very different things, but of course very related. Defunding the police is something that is done kind of to the system, forced by people like us. Voting for a new sheriff is just part and parcel, part of the course. It happens every X amount of years. And when you talk about a city council, maybe there is opportunity for real change or real growth or real opportunity, but you hit the nail on the head, right? Like, what difference does it make what who leads a sheriff's department, they're inherently problematic, and that's an understatement. So tell me your thoughts on defund the police, and tell me why you made that comment. What would you rather see than someone replace him? What how do you get to real change?
Well, I think you get to real change by, having people that are willing to engage with the topic, and talk about things in a way that is more in line with people that are doing the work in those areas, if that makes sense. Like, for example, if we're looking at the sheriff's race specifically, a lot of the activists that have been doing work with the not with the sheriff's department, but in the sheriff's department space, one of the key things that they often ask for and demand is the closure of Men's Central Jail. That's something that the County Board of Supervisors has voted and approved. And that's something that was supposed to be happening. So it doesn't really seem on its face to be something that is controversial, as this is something that has already been approved by county government. And yet it's something that a lot of the sheriff candidates prior to the primary, not all of them would agree to that. And of course, Men's Central Jail, this is a structure that, has been around since the 1960s. It's incredibly outdated. It's dangerous to be inside of. There's mold, there's asbestos. It's not a great place to be for anyone, whether you are forced to live there or you have to work there. It's not a great place. And yet, a lot of candidates were not able to commit to closing that. So real change, I think, would be, having candidates in the running that are in line with activists and saying, yes, this is something that we need to close. Yes, deputy gangs are an issue. And yes, I will, adopt a policy that expressly forbids deputy gangs and goes after people that we know are participating in these deputy gangs. Yes, I will fire people. A lot of that stuff, it seems pretty basic, and it's what people are asking for, but it's really difficult for a lot of candidates to agree to it.
Yeah, speaking of understatements, as a New Yorker, obviously I know quite a bit about jails, right? Very famous one not far from me, Rikers Island, and similar situation, dozens of deaths every year, murder, suicide, sickness that goes untreated, horrible conditions. And you made a good point, not just for the people who have been put there, even though they haven't been found guilty of a crime, but the people who have to work there too. Another kind of result of the system. That is absolutely something that seems like a no-brainer, right? It's like a violation of human rights in our country, right in front of us. I mean, so is solitary confinement, so is the death penalty. And we don't flinch an eye a lot of times at this stuff while we're out doing kind of philanthropy in Africa. Things are happening right around us here. And you absolutely make a good point. Kristen Richardson Jordan was elected here in New York City. Same with Tiffany Caban, and that's how things do start to change. Meanwhile, a lot of people in their communities are doing other things parallel to this to ensure that we don't need politicians or we don't need city councils to make these decisions for us. I interviewed someone really recently, Alex Mingus, who most people hadn't heard of not long ago, but was awarded by a St. Paul Police Department in Minnesota for saving someone's life when the cops wouldn't. And instead of just accepting that award, my new friend basically said, fuck you. Cops don't keep us safe. We keep us safe. Riots work. There are mutual aid efforts. There are community defense efforts, like the things that Alex did during the George Floyd protests, dual power projects. What are your thoughts on working outside the system as an alternative?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely admire the work of community activists and what they're doing. I think that oftentimes, it falls upon people in those spaces to do things that I personally think the state should be doing, or at least have some sort of infrastructure to support people that are doing the work. In Los Angeles, it's raining right now, and I know for a fact that people will probably die of hypothermia because of this rain. And that's really horrific. I know that there are people that are going around and, offering people umbrellas, like dry bedding and that sort of thing. And they do that, out of with their own resources, they're funding themselves with their own time. That's not something that the city does. When we have heat waves here, and we had quite a few not too long ago, honestly, which is kind of ironic with the rain, but that's a whole other conversation. Um, I always see on social media people going and freezing water and putting it in their car and driving it around to hand out to people. And that's not something that the city does. The city even closed its cooling centers during some of these heat waves, which I think is ridiculous. So yes, I think it's necessary way too often to work outside of the system and to rely on each other. And I greatly appreciate the people that are able to do that.
Yeah, well said. LAPD has killed at least one person per week for 20 plus straight years, and cost taxpayers 250 plus million to settle legal claims in the 5 years from 2016 to 2021 alone. And yet there are officers that make $300,000 in 1 year as they ask for additional funding, while you're talking about people using their own money when they don't really have any to help people who have even less. It's like, just an extreme and real example of what we all know happens to teachers nowadays with the lack of funding there, buying their own pencils, for instance, so their students can actually write. Where do you see yourself in all of this? Are you a reporter? Are you a storyteller? What is your role? And then let's get into the story that, you've been telling, that you've now, kind of parlayed into a podcast that, you yourself will be hosting.
Yeah, I definitely see myself as a reporter. And I think that's a very important role in our current society. I think that we have seen I know that we have seen the decimation of local media over the past couple of years, which has really detrimental effects on a free society. We have a flood of misinformation that unfortunately is now making its way into the last remaining vestiges of local media. We have a surge of national media that when news is happening, I believe it's done in a really sloppy way that is often guided by ideals and notions that aren't true. So I think journalism is incredibly important. I think journalists with integrity are few and far between, and I am proud to consider myself one of the remaining.
Yeah. And there's a few reasons why there are fewer and fewer, farther between, or whatever the heck that is. I mean, it is dangerous. The work you do specifically is dangerous. Some of the work that I do or have done is dangerous. Not everything one reports on is. If you talk about local businesses, I mean, I guess you could write a bad story and have a problem with the review. But I mean, when you're talking about police have a lot of authority and a lot of protection in this country. So I imagine you were pretty terrified when you were apprehended not long after releasing that. And you're not the only one who's been targeted, whether it's for their reporting or for their activism. across the world, it's getting more and more dangerous to be a journalist, and more, the truth is harder to discern. Um, I think the most recent example of this maybe is the changes that a lot of people are seeing on Twitter just in the last few days since Elon Musk took over. But, there are the far right channels that for a long time have been, flat out platforming and hosting, if not led by Nazis, indisputably self-proclaimed almost, if not actually. And then you have the mainstream news that it seems to be moving further and further right, which puts all of the work that all of us are doing at more risk. Do you feel that in the work that you do, whether it's locally, with authorities, various levels of authority near you? Do you feel that on the internet, so to speak?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I definitely get a lot of right-wing flack on the internet. But I am lucky in the sense that it is very contained to the same sort of group of people. I think it's probably a cast of about 10 people total that manage about 30 different accounts. And they seem to all be the same people just based on their typing styles and their names. But I am lucky in the sense that it seems to be sort of an echo chamber of the same couple of folks. Here in LA County, we do have a smaller population of, really hardcore right-wing extremist types, which is great. And I'd love to keep it that way.
Yeah, obviously. And there's some places that are, crazier. Portland, that area, for instance, it seems to be harder to avoid. I don't live in New York City anymore. And I don't really run into what I'm starting to see more and more of in the city. When I lived there, this was before George Bush. I mean, not before George Bush, before Donald Trump. And it felt like they were under their rocks still. I just saw a picture from a friend of mine who still lives in the city, an activist on the ground who wasn't there either, but a photo of someone in like full Nazi regalia, like as if he was straight out of Hitler's World War II. Just sitting at a bar, nobody touched him. That's not the way that I was raised. I would have at least made sure he didn't feel comfortable just sitting there. So in that context, how did you end up focusing on the sheriff specifically? What makes what they do particularly bad in the, amid society where those very same Nazis inhabit the police departments, and where those police departments across the country kill 6+ people a day?
Yeah, well, I really focused in on the sheriff's department because the deputy gang issue was something I had heard about my whole life, and it was something that had not been investigated up until I did it. And it was something that I felt needed to be done. It was an investigation that I always wanted to read and that I was always looking for, but no one had done it. So I figured, all right, well, why not do it myself? I'm certainly qualified. And why them? Well, like I said, I had heard about them since I was a child, and it's also, they're a pretty significant department when it comes to policing structures in the United States. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is the largest law enforcement agency in this country. The policies and practices that are adopted or developed in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department are often lent out or given to other smaller departments across the United States, and they are implementing this in their own locales. Several departments come to Los Angeles to train with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, so they are getting exposed right there to these deputy gangs and their style of policing, which is very concerning to residents, across the United States, because they are potentially bringing back these dangerous practices to your hometown.
Yeah, that's scary enough for me, and it is particularly brutal. Can you tell us some of the craziest things that you uncovered or discovered over the time, and describe what it, the actual process, how you came to develop what you ended up releasing to the public?
Yeah, so in order to write my 15-part series on deputy gangs, it was a lot of public records requests and a lot of reading. I was able to find a list of about 66 cases that pertain to deputy gangs. And from there, I was able to use, once I had identified those deputy gang members, I was able to look into their records and uncover additional shootings or incidents, uses of force, car accidents, that sort of thing, just other so-called bad behavior. And the outcome was the 15-part series that I published with Knock LA.
Yeah, and I talk a lot about a phenomenon called wandering cops, which is basically police officers who commit horrible crimes actually are held accountable, not to the extent that they should, not to the extent that any non-police officer or non-rich and powerful white person would, but they are fired. They wander down the street and get a new job. Derek Chauvin is an example of one that didn't even have to wander. He stayed and was involved in 5 murders before killing George Floyd. And then you have these guys who not only also haven't wandered, but they get promoted, and it's actually tied to gang activity. I mean, I think I'd speak pejoratively a lot about cops being the biggest gang in the world, or at least in this country, certainly the most protected, most powerful, most extremely violent, potentially catastrophic military weaponry. But this is an actual gang. Can you describe what that means, what similarities there are to what most people would think of when you say gang?
Yeah, it's really essentially the same thing. The California Penal Code defines a gang as a group of 3 or more people that share a common tattoo, hand sign, logo, are involved in about 20 plus crimes as defined under the California Penal Code that further the profile, existence of a gang. And these deputy gangs definitely meet that definition. These gangs, they have these tattoos, they have these hand signs, they're involved in things like money laundering, extortion, murder, that sort of thing. So they're really just like, what we think of as typical like street gang organizations. The only difference is that deputy gangs are funded by taxpayers, and they are given the blessing of county government to go on and conduct themselves in this manner, in that they are granted, badges, they are granted the ability to go out and shoot and kill people, to brutally maim people with no consequence.
There it is. That should say it all. How can people learn more? You said it's a 15-part series with Knock.LA, but then you also have a podcast. Where do you recommend people go to learn more about this? And tell us about that podcast. Is it going to be kind of a telling of that same story, or are you going to have guests and kind of expand on where you started?
Yeah, the podcast is out now. It's called A Tradition of Violence. And the podcast is taking the work that I did in my series and continuing the investigation, making use of what I've been able to uncover in the past year. It is a narrative podcast. It's me telling you the story, and you're going to hear the voices of some of these characters, deputies that have seen deputy gangs up close, that have tried to whistleblow and faced horrific consequences themselves, people that have survived brutal attacks by deputy gang members. I'm looking into the careers of some of these high-ranking deputy gang members or deputy gang affiliates. We just had an episode last week about Alex Villanueva, looking at his career ahead of Election Day, which is today when we're recording this. The next episode is looking at Robert Luna, who is the challenger to Sheriff Alex Villanueva and very well might be our next sheriff. Depending on what the outcome is, which we'll know in a week or two. And yeah, the investigation will be exploring I've uncovered 20 different deputy gangs now, so we'll be diving into all of them and looking at all of the awful things they've been able to get up to for the past 50 years.
Wow. 50 years and 20 gangs. I don't think people realize that. I mean, I think thanks to you, many people know about the gangs, but I don't know if people realize that it's not just one gang, it's 20, nor do they realize how long this has been going on, which of course makes any kind of change even harder. It's built in. You also kind of told me that this is coming to life. It's like they say pictures are worth 1,000 words or whatever. I mean, being able to hear these people alongside you as you tell this story, that sounds really exciting. I mean, I honestly think that for anyone watching this, if you're a true crime person, this sounds like it's right up your alley. If you're a a mafia podcast person, this is right up your alley. And if you're like me and you are an abolitionist and you hate the police and you want change, this is right up your alley. I'm sure there's a lot of material that folks like us will be able to use to continue to reiterate our points. Cerise, that sounds amazing. I hope we hear something positive today and over the next couple weeks as far as the elections go. Is there anything else that you want to let my audience know? I am going to share this on election day today. So is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is particularly important for people to consider?
I would just tell people, hey, make sure you get to the polls. They close in California at 8 p.m. and you can vote as long as you are in line before 8 p.m. I would encourage your voters to please subscribe to my podcast. It's available anywhere you can get a podcast. Again, it's A Tradition of Violence. And for breaking news and updates on the deputy gangs, you can follow LASD gangs on all social media. You can follow me as well for my original reporting. I am at Cerise Castle on Twitter, at Your Majesty on Instagram. And we have a new episode of Tradition of Violence coming out tomorrow. So make sure you're subscribed and you'll get that episode first thing in the morning.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cerise. Stay in touch. Keep up the incredible work. All the awards are well deserved.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Talk to you soon.